Now let's take a look at advanced features in Broadway Gig, starting with just instruments. Opening here a tenor saxophone legato. So we already listened to some of the articulations, and we see that we can reach all the articulations with, real time. But we didn't look at any of the settings beyond that. So on that main screen here, the monitor, we see different articulations and they're triggered, and that's very helpful to see what we're doing, different types of vibrato, etc. We can also shift octaves here by up to 2 octaves in each direction with this slider. And we can also switch between different modes of dynamics. Basically, when you play with velocity only, depending on how loudly you play, it plays. But what happens with modulation wheel? Well, Broadway Gig responds to modulation wheel as well at all times. So, for example, if we play something loud and we want to decrescendo, we can do that after the fact. Or play softly. You can see, even though the modulation wheel is all the way up, I just pushed it quickly down, and it still worked perfectly. So that said, it's not a good idea in that hybrid mode of keyboard and MIDI-CC to keep moving this all the time. So if you do that, it really confuses the system. You play... It just doesn't sound very good. It's not how you're supposed to use it. If you want to use modulation wheel to drive dynamics, just use this key switch, and voila, it's MIDI-CC only. Now you can move it freely. And there's no problem, because it completely ignores the keyboard velocity at this point. That said, personally, I usually use it in this mode, use the modulation wheel sparsely, only when nothing else gives me the effect. Because again, if you need crescendo, they're pre-recorded in different speeds, so you could just use them and stop them and change to, articulation at will, so you could do something like this. Or... So it's very, very flexible anyway. No need to really use a modulation wheel for stuff like that. Now, moving on, let's go to the options page here quickly. And you can see that there are tools here to control velocity further. So if velocity is a little difficult to control, especially in an instrument like a trombone, where the dynamic range of the instrument is far exceeding what you usually get from a keyboard, it's kind of hard to tame, and then these controls can help you manipulate the velocity curve to make it respond a little bit more predictably. Moving on, there is another interesting thing here. So we have 4 instruments here, but in reality, we're not really limited to 4 instruments, because each of these instruments can be built up to a larger section. We can use the same instrument multiple times in the section, as in multiple instances of the same exact instrument. So, for example, we have here 1 tenor saxophone. But if we want to have a section of saxophones, we can easily just add a bunch more. Let's do 4 of them. And you can do up to 5 of the same instrument playing in unison, still very realistically. The way it works is it uses a different sample for each of them, just by knowing that they're supposed to be in a different position in the section. So, for example, these 4 saxophones are 1, 2, 3, and 4 in their position in the unison section. Now, since I'm demoing this from one keyboard and not sequencing it, I'm going to place them all on the same MIDI channel. So MIDI channel number 1. It doesn't have to be 1 in this case, but I'm using 1 right now. And before I do anything, I'm going to just play a little bit, and you can see that it sounds like a single instrument. Even though they're all playing. To make it sound like a section, I just have to turn on this feature. And by doing that, it makes them use different samples. And there's a little bit of a manipulation there in tone, and it sounds like this. Now, it doesn't sound very natural that way. One thing to do when you build a section like that is just panning them a little bit away from each other to create a little bit more space. So this already is going to sound better. Other problem is it's a little bit too perfect. No saxophone section is going to sound that tight. And just to add a little bit of more realism, you can add a little bit of detune and a little bit of humanize, which is just really slight delay in some of them. This is not the actual amount of detune or actual amount of delay. This is just values for that algorithm. So let's give it a small amount here. Let's say 5 on the detune, just doing them one by one here. And then 25, let's say, on the humanize. I'm typing it in here, but you could use the slider, or you can connect it to a MIDI CC with a learn function to whichever way you want to input it. It is valid. Let's take a listen. Now, this feature is not necessarily going to be used this way. This is just for the demo. When you sequence things and you play each instrument on its own MIDI channel, you would only turn this on, and this is, by the way, programmable, so you can turn it on and off with these controls. You will only turn it on when instruments play in unison. In other situations, you just don't need it. And so it's very, very flexible. It's not just a single multi with multiple instruments playing a section, but you can actually have each instrument play on its own track and only turn this Unison Section feature on when you need it. Let's move on to one more thing before we go to Real-Time Orchestrator, which is the way Broadway Gig deals with alternate samples. Alternate samples, also referred to as round robin. Basically, the way you alternate between different takes of the same articulation to make it sound more natural when you repeat the same note multiple times in the same articulation, avoiding triggering the same sample over and over again, which creates the machine gun effect. Now, what we do is we have a separate cycle of alternates for each note in each articulation and each dynamic level, which creates hundreds of cycles in each instrument. Pretty crazy, but repeatable. And in order for you to control that chaos, if you like a certain specific combination of alternates in your song, you are able to store and restore and reset cycles and trigger it with MIDI events so that you could actually repeat the exact take in situations where it makes a difference. That's really, really advanced. Most people never use this, but it's there for the high demanding advanced users. And last but not least, let's take a look at a very special type of multi, Real-Time Orchestrator multi, and how that works. And I'm going to load the onstage quartet, which has one of each of the instruments of this library in it. So there's a trumpet, a trombone, a tenor saxophone, and a baritone saxophone. And the cool thing is that based on the orchestration scheme that you choose, it orchestrates it in real time, distributes the notes in real time, and follows the legato lines of each instrument, playing the legato samples appropriately. So, for example, if I just play one note, according to this orchestration scheme, they're all going to play in unison together. Very, very similar to the regular legato multis. But if I play two notes, something completely different happens. Or three notes. Or four. All right, let's take a look a little bit deeper here. So that was a single octave orchestration scheme, and in this particular one, we set it up so that the bari sax can play solo at the bottom and be answered by the rest. If we switch to the double octave option here, then it behaves completely differently. All of the instruments play here in a double octave setup when you play one note, but spread again when you play more. If we look under the hood here in this double octave orchestration scheme, we see that there are a bunch of voicing tables connected to different scenarios. One voice, two voices, three voices, four voices. These are four instruments, but if you have more instruments in it, you can add up to 10 voices. Here, let's take a look at three voices. And you can see that when you play three voices, you have the top voice, voice one, playing trumpet and trombone an octave below it. And then tenor saxophone playing in the same octave, and baritone saxophone playing in the same octave, sounding like this. So basically the trombone is doubling the top voice. But when you go to four voices, that doubling disappears because it just plays the four voices you're playing. So we take a look at this and we see that the top is the trumpet, then trombone, then tenor saxophone, then baritone saxophone. Now, in some cases, the baritone saxophone might not go low enough, whereas the trombone can. So in these cases, there's a fallback option, just a second voicing table here. And if we look at that, we see that the trombone goes to the bottom here, and the baritone saxophone switches places with it, which allows the trombone to be in the bottom and play those very low notes in the chord, just as played. Now, how did we get these doubling of the octaves? If we go here in the unison, in one voice, they're all playing, but you can see that the trombone and the baritone saxophone are in a lower octave. And that's just determined by clicking this and changing the octave. So this is lower, higher. You can also limit the playable range of an instrument here, effectively forcing it to go to a fallback table and do things like what we saw with the bari sax in the other orchestration scheme. Very, very cool. On top of that, you have these articulation presets. These are really usable when you use different triggers like pedals. And you can connect articulations that normally require more than one key switch at a time to be triggered by a single pedal. This is especially important when in the options here, you choose to completely remove the normal key switching, allowing you effectively to play with both hands, only playable notes without any key switches in the way. So the way you do it, you go to instrument key switches. Right now it's enabled. You can go disabled. When it's disabled, the only thing that's effective here is these presets. I'm going to actually re-enable it here for now and explain one more thing in the options, which is auto staccato. Auto staccato allows you to play without using any key switches, and when you play very, very short note, it automatically triggers a staccato or staccatissimo. Here you can decide if it's staccatissimo or staccato. By default, it's staccatissimo. So you get something like this. And lastly, let's take a look at how RTO, Real-Time Orchestrator, manages Unison Section automatically. So I'm going to go to this 4-trombone orchestration, just 4 instances of the same trombone. But with the management of Real-Time Orchestrator, you can either play chords in legato, or you can play unison. And it's a completely realistic section. So you can play this. It's like 2 and 2. So yeah, it looks like 1 trombone, but it plays like 4. And that's the case for each of the instruments in the library. You can make your own multis, both RTO and otherwise, and save them and use them. It's very, very powerful, very flexible, and can be lots of fun.